She is just 10 minutes away. We should start in about 10 minutes' time. We would like to thank our sponsors for helping us bring this festival together. DSC Group, Tata Steel, Bank of America, American Center, RP Sanjeev Goenka Group, the sponsors of this venue. American Center, Times of India, Coca-Cola, IDFC, Rio Tinto, Councilage, IPPAI, Global Energy, Google, NewsX, Penguin, British Council, Sula, Jan Mikulski Foundation, and JCB. We will start in about 10 to 15 minutes time. Thank you for your patience.
I'm happy here. Oh.
Morning, everybody. Sorry for that slight delay, which was all about flights not being able to take off from Delhi because of the fog. But I'm delighted to introduce Anna Pavord to all of you. Many of you will know her work as a gardening expert and a garden expert. Many of you will know her. I mean, what amazes me about her work really is not just that there's a lot of practical books, how-to books about, gardening and shrubbery and kitchen gardens, but also some very, very lovely books like The Naming of Names, which is about plant taxonomy, which is one of her wonderful, wonderful works. And now, of course, the tulip, which is an amazing plant, not simply in itself, but also because of the politics of the tulip and what happened to the tulip, especially in 17th century Holland. And I won't stand between you and Anna anymore. And can I hand it over to you, Anna?
Thank you. And first of all, my sincere apologies for such a rushed arrival in sort of very much travelling shoes, the good old Converse, take you anywhere. But the thing was that we actually stepped onto the plane in Delhi at 5 o'clock this morning, and we were held on the plane for 5 hours before the thing took off. And I've literally been handed from person to person through the entrance here like a brown paper parcel. So if I arrive looking like a bit of ragged post, that's exactly what I am. But I'm here to talk to you about the tulip. And I know that tulip mania is supposed to have stopped in that great year in Amsterdam when the crash happened, 1637. But here I am, sitting in front of you, living proof that the tulip mania is alive and well, and certainly throbbing in many parts of the UK. And of course, it is well known to you here in India. That's the wonderful thing about the tulip. Even if nature didn't put it in a place, it was so staggeringly prized by men for its beauty, its changeability, its sexiness, its extraordinary capability to throw new tricks every time it flowered, that actually it found itself transported to all sorts of places where man reveled in growing it. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the most subtle, the most powerful, the most intriguing flower that ever grew on earth, and that includes orchids. And if there's anybody amongst you who are Americans, I know that orchids are way up there as the most favorite plant in the world. I'll challenge you to a duel on the orchid front, and I bet I'll win with tulips. Now, I don't think there's anybody who's ever actually seen a tulip for the first time who hasn't thought, crumbs, what a thing. And when you're taken by that first smash of the colour, then perhaps you're drawn into looking into the inside of the flower. And then you see that extraordinary complexity of the different colour of the base, of the superb colour of the stamens, of the pollen. Why is what humans say. I know we deck ourselves out in the odd bit of clothes, but quite honestly, it is nothing to what the tulip does for no reason, which is why actually I love it all the more, because it is just as beautiful to a pollinating insect, plain red, as it is striped and freckled, and all the amazing colours that over a whole series of years it showed gardeners what it could do. Now, of course, the whole business of tulips starts, as all flowers do, with species. Nature provides us with these amazing building blocks which she scatters around, and then waits to see what is actually going to happen between these particular species. And nature provides certain opportunities for intercrosses to be made between the species. But of course, once man got his hand on it, he wanted to speed up the process. And therefore, we now find ourselves in the situation of there perhaps being 5,000 different sorts of tulips that we can actually grow, whereas the species number only in hundreds. But when I started falling in love with tulips, of course, had to go and see what these building blocks were. And that was the beginning. I'm finding problems in actually moving the picture on for some reason. I can't think why. There we go. You can see here some of the first engravings that were made in the west of the tulip, the Hortus floridus by Crispin de Pass. And this actually was rather a downfall for me, this particular picture, because when I was researching the tulip and looking for all these species, these building blocks, I went off to Holland, where one of our big auction houses, Sotheby's, was holding a sale which they called most titillatingly Tulip Mania. So I thought it'll be very good for my research, I must go. So my husband and I drove over to Holland and went to the sale room, bought a catalogue, learnt a great deal from it, but then the fatal thing was actually going to the sale itself. And when this particular lot came up, Crispin de Pass's Hortus floridus, published 1613, some extraordinary sort of thing made me put my arm up like this when the bidding started, and I found myself at the end of the auction the proud owner of this thing, and we lived on bean soup for months afterwards. But it is worth it. Oh, I tell you, it's worth it. There is not a time when I approach this catalogue, still in its old brown paper covers, when I'm not actually glad that that extraordinary force made me bid for this beautiful thing. Holland, of course, is taken by most people as the place of the tulip. But in fact, they were quite late into the game because they proved themselves fantastic sellers. They are great at marketing, as the whole world knows. The Dutch are brilliant at selling things, and the Dutch also know that nobody's going to bother to learn their language because it's so full of extraordinary sounds that nobody but a Dutchman can make. And so they are all superbly well educated in other languages, which we, I'm afraid, as a race in Britain are not. But they became great sellers of the flower, although that is not where the tulip was born. The tulip actually, this is again one of the lovely pictures that were made at the time by those who first saw this gorgeous thing. This is Jan van Huysum's picture of the tulip. Why can I not get this thing to move on? It's usually terribly good. Now it's gone too fast. This is going to be a nightmare. But after having actually seen how many species grew in the wild, I actually, of course, wanted to go and see one of these tulips growing where nature put it in its wild place. I had grown hundreds and hundreds in the garden, but I told myself this was not the same thing as seeing a proper wild tulip. And so the first tulip we set out to look for was in the island of Crete, and it was called Tulipa bakeri. And as you can see, it's rather a restrained, elegant tulip, Schiaparelli pink, with that gorgeous flash of brilliant yellow at the bottom. And it was to be found, so I was told, high in the olive groves of this island of Crete. And so we set off, and I was full of this zeal of the hunter-gatherer to track down this amazing flower, the first wild tulip I would ever have seen growing in the wild. And I'd been told by kind and friendly botanists that we would find it high on this plain called the Omelos Plain, ringed by mountains that in April when we were there were still topped with snow. And I jumped out of our rented car, and like a bloodhound I was up and down those olive groves, backwards and forwards, tracking this tulip. And could we find it? No. So then, in a real rage, a hunter-gatherer rage, I started going up the mountains, got way up into the snow line, way beyond any place where any tulip would want to grow, and there found all sorts of lovely things. This tulip and gorgeous crocuses, but it was not what I'd set out to find. I only wanted bakeri. So I threw a snowball at an eagle and I stomped down that mountain in an absolutely filthy mood. And my husband, who had seen which way the wind was blowing, had got the picnic out of the car, settled himself against a rock, and was reading his book. And then when I got up to him, he said, "Is this what you were looking for?" And once again, I'm afraid it's done the wrong thing. It was growing there right by his feet. And that was such a sort of awful shame for me, because magnificent though he is in many respects, he doesn't, or at that stage, didn't really know a tulip from a tiger lily. And this marvellous thing had shown itself to him before I had actually set eyes on it. But it was a very, very good lesson in humility. You do not set out for one of these amazing flowers in this aggressive, acquisitive mood. It sets the agenda, it decides the time and the place, and when it feels you are in a suitably humble frame of mind, then it will reveal itself in all its glory. And so I hope I've never forgotten that important lesson that I learnt on the Omelos plain in Crete. But then, of course, there started this extraordinary round of research, which took about 6 years, actually. I mean, most books take me about 6 years, no matter what subject I set myself at. But the tulip was so riveting, the difficulty was actually telling myself when to stop researching. And of course, everybody knows that one great seminal fact about the tulip mania. But actually less known is the fact that it is by nature an Eastern flower. It is not a flower really of the West. And it was first seen in the West in about the mid-16th century. I'm having problems again. I wonder whether... No, here we go. Brought from this place, Kazakhstan, which is where finally my husband and I went riding with Kazakh horsemen through these amazing foothills of the Tian Shan and the Pamir Alai, and saw tulips in huge great spreads, rolling as far as the eye could see. And that was a very, very humbling experience. On one side, you'd see Tulipa gregii growing always on the sunny side of the valley. On the other side, you would see Tulip kaufmanniana growing always on the shady side of the valley. Useful things you always learn in the wild. And then down by the stream, these two species shaking hands and producing children, the like of which no botanist has ever tried to actually get his head around. And it is only by chance that some botanist decided that Tulipa gregii should be described as a red tulip. Because when you're out there on the hill, you see that they're trying all sorts of colours. Red, orange, yellow, cream, spotted, striped, black centres, no black centres. Nature is a marvel in that way, and it is only man who actually seems to want to control this and slam the lid of a box on a tulip and say, that is what you are. But they are constantly escaping from the box and saying, bet you never thought of this trick. So from these wonderful wild species came, of course, all the marvellous tulips that we grow now in our gardens. Now, sorry I'm having so much trouble with this. The first tulip actually arrived from these amazing eastern parts in the baggage of a Flemish ambassador, Ogier de Busbecq. And Constantinople, of course, became available to the West after it fell in 1453, and gradually embassies were re-established there. And the tulip, which of course was always known in this part of the world and appeared in these wonderful miniatures around the sides of the Mughal miniature paintings, it then made this great and seminal leap into the West, and was described by this botanist Konrad Gesner, growing at Augsburg, and he described its wonderful red petals and, interestingly, its smell. Now, smell is not something that we generally associate with a tulip, but it's there. And Gesner's scratchy writing records this attribute on the side of this painting, which he caused to be made, the first painting ever made of the tulip in the West. And that was quite a moment. And you can see there the very characteristic wasted, flipped top that the tulip actually still exhibits in the beautiful flowers that we grow in our garden. And I made myself a pact when I first fell in love with tulips that I would grow every available tulip that I could find listed in the Dutch bulb lists. But the sad thing is, I realise now that actually my life is not going to be long enough. I'm already 71 and there's thousands more still to go. I've got to increase the hit rate, but there isn't enough earth to put them in. But this is my tulip of tulips, and it's called Magier. It has old French blood in it, and it starts the colour of clotted cream, and then as it ages, which it does gracefully and well, this purple leaches down through the petals until at the moment that it dies, it's a completely different animal. It is the most mesmerising performance. And here in the rectory garden where we lived for more than, well, about 40 years, you can see that actually it deigned to establish itself. And that is not always easy in our climate in Britain, because there it is at the very western edge of actually what it's looking for. Here it would be so much happier. Perhaps not in Rajasthan, but it needs hot, hot, hot baking in the summer. And that's what initiates the flower bud that actually then the following season comes out so beautifully into the flower. We don't get those bakings in England in more than about once in every 20 years. But the spring that happens after that, you notice the most wonderful flowering of your plants. So this was a great, actually, a great discovery for me, that you could make tulips settle in some circumstances, especially if they had this old French blood. It can never have been a Western flower. You look at the old tapestries, you look at all sorts of things that happened in the West, paintings, illustrations, but you don't actually ever see a tulip in the very earliest of those. Not until this great time of tulip mania, which happened in Holland. And then, of course, you get an explosion of tulip paintings and illustrations of particular flowers that were driving tulip mania. Why did it happen? Why amongst the Dutch? Amongst madder races you might have seen tulip mania happening, but the Dutch, so steady, so careful, particularly with their money. Why did tulip mania happen there? Well, it was partly a matter of timing. The Dutch East India Company had set up, of course, and brought enormous wealth into Holland, and these burghers had lovely formal gardens. You can see here in a map of Haarlem how beautifully laid out those little formal gardens were. And they amassed collections of this most desirable flower, which was always less available than they wanted. One of the great directors of the Dutch East India Company had the entire known quantity of bulbs of this particular tulip called Semper Augustus, considered amongst connoisseurs the most beautiful tulip that was ever grown. But only 12 bulbs were known to exist. Just 12 bulbs. Why? If people wanted these things, didn't they make more? Well, there was a curious combination of circumstances that stopped that. People discovered very early on that actually you could put a plain coloured tulip into the ground and that it would come up the following year spiked and streaked and spotted in different colours. It happened to me at home. This is a tub of plain purple tulips that we planted. The following year, this is what happened. How does that happen? Well, of course, in Holland, at the time of tulip mania, nobody could work it out. They thought it was magic. They thought it was alchemy. People laid coloured paints on their tulip beds, hoping that the colours would drift down through the earth, seep into the bulb, and bounce out of the flower the following year. Well, it had a certain sort of practical delight, that theory, but it was not what actually made this break happen. It could never have been unravelled in the 16th century, which is why the tulip acquired this strange quality of alchemy. And the real reason for these astonishing breaks, as they were called, and it was only the broken, striped, feathered and flamed tulips that were prized by the people who drove tulip mania. They were the only sort that they wanted. Plain coloured tulips by then were 2 a penny. But in 1926, with the aid of a microscope, a sort of atomic type of microscope, a Miss Dorothy Cayley, working at a research institute in the east of England, discovered that actually this is caused by a virus, perhaps the only known case of a virus which gardeners think of as bad things, making flowers actually more beautiful than they were at the beginning. And she discovered that it was a sort of black fly, green fly creature, we call them aphids at home, that every now and again it fed on the sap of the tulips, and perhaps once every 2,000 or 3,000 sucks, as it were, it injected this virus into the tulip. A plain coloured tulip, the virus would drift down through the stem as the flower died, lodge in the bulb, and there work its magic within the bulb and change the quality of the colour. In effect, removing what botanists call anthocyanin, which is the red colouring on the petal, in great swathes, revealing what lies underneath, which is always white or yellow. And she actually, in 1926, wrote a paper that laid out this extraordinary sequence of events that had to happen before a tulip could break, none of which could possibly be known at the time of tulip mania. So because there was a great deal of money sloshing around, and because there was never enough of the commodity that people wanted, you got this boom. It's the same with any commodity that's in short supply that suddenly becomes intensely fashionable. And so you find that actually these amazing scenes took place of stealing bulbs, of people roping dogs to trees so that if somebody came to steal a bulb, the dog would leap out, the bell would ring in the tree, and out would come the man to chase the robber away. All sorts of devices were laid out to protect tulip bulbs, and they were treated just like racehorses. A consortium of people would get together to buy one single bulb, like the greatest racehorse that ever ran on a British course. And they would then put this precious thing in the care of a grower, effectively a trainer, who knew exactly what to do with this bulb to bring it through to fruition. The other reason that actually diminished the supply was that even once you got your broken flower, because that flower was effectively diseased, it could not produce its little baby offsets. All of us who garden know that bulbs do this lovely thing of setting seed, but also providing us with these little daughter bulbs clustered round the mother. But because these bulbs were weakened by the virus, they could only produce one offset perhaps every 12 years. And that actually didn't do much to increase the supply. So all these reasons in the most extraordinary way came together. And perhaps now you can see why I became obsessed by this research. Why actually I never wanted to finish it, because there were so many extraordinary things happening with this flower. And they all came together in tulip mania. And perhaps the whole thing came into a sort of focus for me when I realized that the great flower painters of the Golden Age would get perhaps 5,000 guilders for one of their beautiful flower pieces, the Dutch Golden Age of flower painting it's called. But at a single flower auction in 1636, one bulb of Admiral Liefken's tulip went for 4,800 guilders. So in fact it was ever so much cheaper to get one of these guys in, whoever it was, Jan van Husum, Bruegel, all these wonderful flower painters, Boschert, and get them to paint a picture than it was to acquire the real thing. And that is when the enormity of tulip mania really came into close focus for me. But there were people, of course, who didn't approve of what was going on, and all sorts of satirical pamphlets were published saying, oh, this is extraordinary, this is so wrong. And Crispin de Passe, who painted the flowers in the book that I bid for, also made this very famous cartoon called The Fool's Cap. You can see the fool's cap, tulip trading's going on inside, and the growers are down in that bottom corner with their rake. They're satisfied because they're certainly going to make money. And you can see a rich buyer come to buy. He's actually, well, with me anyway, he's on the left-hand side of the fool's cap. You can tell he's rich by his lace collar, but behind him stands this extraordinary, frightening figure of the devil with an hourglass. The time of tulip mania is nearly at an end. So this would have been as easy to decipher at the time of tulip mania as political cartoons are for us today. All the signs were there, and they were all saying, this is nuts. And this famous painting by Hendrik Potts was then turned into an engraving. And interestingly, all those discarded tulips that Flora, the Queen of Flowers, is chucking out from her wagon in this engraving are given names. And when you're researching, that's so incredibly useful because you know that those were some of the top tulips of the time. And once you have names, you can actually have something to hang on to in your research. But actually the mania, in a much lesser way, went on all over Europe. It happened in the great gardens in Britain. This is a famous tapestry hanging in the Victoria and Albert Museum showing beautiful formal gardens of the early 17th century, planted with tulips, but used like jewels, planted very far apart in the beds, because they were just there to be looked at singly. Tulips as bedding plants had not been invented. And you also, if you went to Germany, you would find the archbishops, the bishops, all sorts of people who should have had their mind on other things, growing masses of tulips, 600 of them in the Bishop of Eichstadt's garden, and beautifully drawn in these tulip albums that now have become such extraordinary treasures. If you went to France, you would find the Duc d'Orléans, the brother of Louis XIV, commissioning these amazing vellum paintings of the flowers that he was growing, which included, of course, absolutely wonderful tulips. What did those women of Louis XIV's court wear when they went to those great balls, those banquets, those fêtes champêtres? Did they go to their jewel boxes and pull out some vast emerald, some vast sapphire? No. In season, what they wore, pinned to the front of their bodice, was a single tulip flower. Because they knew, as everybody else at court would know, that that flower was worth more than any jewel they could pull from their box. So to a different extent, that desire, that love of tulips actually happened in all over Europe. But it never went into that financial mania that actually drove the Dutch into such an extraordinary madness, brought to an end by the Dutch state, who stepped in and said, enough already, this is crazy. And they then insisted that all outstanding sales notices should be cashed in at only 10% of their value, which suited the buyers but didn't suit the sellers at all. So, of course, there was then another great horde of court claims and counterclaims as people tried to get the original value of these amazing flowers. So it was something that really is quite difficult for us to understand now. But the first tulips also traveled into America with those Dutch immigrants who founded New York, called then, of course, New Amsterdam. And this is how it looked, their little settlement at the edge of the land there. And it was very touching to me the first time I ever went to New York to walk down between those great cliffs of skyscrapers on Fifth Avenue and realize that deep in their basements lay the ghosts of the very first tulips that ever grew on American soil. They are there still, waving at you, saying, "Remember me?" And of course, that was again a most amazing marketing move for the Dutch, because the tulips astonishingly grew in New Amsterdam. And gradually, an extraordinary market grew up amongst these Dutch and German colonizers, so homesick for the beautiful flowers of home, the tulips, the iris, the ranunculus, that an amazing trade grew up, actually supplying these immigrants with their flowers. And here is Mr. van der Schoot, a Dutchman, of course, actually the first man ever to travel as a traveling salesman in tulip bulbs in the States. He looks pretty determined, doesn't he? But in those days, it took 6 weeks to make the crossing from Rotterdam to the United States. And this poor man was seasick the entire time. He still thought it worthwhile because he came back with that nice, fat, full order book. Lots more immigrants wanted tulips. And so Mr. van der Schoot, despite his desperate seasickness, recorded in his diaries, went out again and again on this newly lucrative trail. They are astonishingly lovely things. They are things that actually still take me each spring with that astonishment that actually they have come through. The mice haven't eaten them, the voles haven't eaten them, the squirrels haven't dug them up. Here they are again with us. And we had a very strange sort of flowering in England of tulip societies, mostly in the 19th century. And it was artisans, people who worked in factories, who were shoemakers, who were cutlers. It wasn't then a grand business at all. Tulips had been thrown out from the grand gardens because a vandal called Capability Brown had come along and said, what you want is nice big landscapes, trees and sheep, definitely no flowers. And they were thrown on the scrap heap and taken up by this other completely different class of grower who grow these things most beautifully still. There is one remaining society still just growing tulips, and they show them in the old way. They show them actually in brown beer bottles, because of course, if you think of these people, they had no money to spare on anything at all, working in factories. This was a wonderful source of beauty for them. And they then staged these extraordinary competitions where these exquisite flowers were just stuck in brown beer bottles, because the meetings were nearly always held in our pubs, free lit light, free heat, free containers. And this tradition still continues, that these amazing flowers are shown in this way. So I'm just going to finish this talk, because there's only so much that I can test your patience, with a quick account of our journey to Turkey. Now, I do think that actually Turkey was the first instance you get of a very different attitude to the tulip, a very special shape that the tulip had to be. And this is typical, of course, of the Ottoman tulip, which is so beautifully featured on their tiles. Always this same very, very beautiful wasted shape. And only now commemorated in terms of paper paintings in one book. I knew about this book. It was owned by a Belgian, and I had permission to go and see it in Belgium, and then he died. And after 9 months, the book came up for sale in London at Christie's. And once again, I got permission to spend a morning with it. And I remember the feel of its pages, the smell of its cover, leather covered, the exquisite nature of these drawings in the only book that now survives to show Ottoman tulips. This was one of those fleeting moments where you need luck, because the next day, this was bought by an incredibly private man in Qatar for his own library, and will never be seen, I guess, again. And I was so grateful for fortune allowing me this amazing time with this one book showing these extraordinary Ottoman tulips. And of course, we had to make that journey into eastern Turkey, bordering on Iraq and Iran. Many people told us not to make it because it just happened to be a time when the Kurds were active, shall we say. And we were given two marvelous pieces of advice. Always tell the shepherds why you are here and what you are doing. The second piece of advice, never follow a Turkish army convoy. Very, very good pieces of advice, and we stuck to them. We actually were constantly surrounded by the army, telling us to get out, everything out of the car, machine guns in our chest. And whenever they said, why are you here? We just said, tulips, lale in Turkish. And of course they thought we were completely screwy, but they never stopped us. And I was so grateful that actually we were still allowed to hunt for flowers in the midst of actually what was rather an unpleasant war going on around us. And I don't regret that combination of events, because it seemed to me that our survival and the fact that the army allowed us to continue shows again the strength of beauty over those conflicts. And there was a wonderful time right at the end of our journey looking for tulips when we found the most gorgeous spreads of these things in a very remote valley. We'd climbed and climbed and climbed, and there were these pools of beautiful red tulips in the limestone brash between the rocks. And I didn't quite know which tulip it was, and I lay down on a rock in the sun, spread-eagled in this wild, wild, savagely beautiful place, and tried to think, Tulipa Armina, Tulipa Julia, which? And something made me open my eyes, lying on my back in the sun, and there sitting next to me was a wolf with his tail beautifully curled round his feet. And for a moment I thought, this is a mirage. This is something again that has been given to us. And I sat bolt upright, and with that, the wolf ran away to its lair underneath the rocks. It was a real wolf, all right. But again, a marvelous conjunction of events, because both these things, the tulip and the wolf, living together in this wild, wild valley for thousands of years before man ever set eyes on either of them. And I knew, actually, sitting on in the sun there, thinking of that extraordinary luck to actually wake with the wolf as my companion, that actually, yes, I am, that those tulips would be living their lives in those caverns underneath the rocks, dreaming up tricks that we as mere humans could never even begin to think of. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Anna. That was absolutely extraordinary. I'm not sure we have time for questions.
We have time for just about a question or two.
A question.
Right.
Who has the nicest question to ask Anna?
Yes.
These beautiful old tulips we see in these old paintings of 300 or 400 years ago, are they still available, or are they still able to be created, or are they lost forever?
They are not lost forever, and this was a miraculous thing that I didn't go into. Remember those tulips in beer bottles? Those are direct descendants of those amazing tulips that the Dutch artists were painting. Those florists kept the blood of those flowers alive, and it still exists. But it has long been a rule amongst the florist societies that no bulb is ever bought or sold. It is only given. And therefore, money can never make you the winner of a competition. Skill only can actually make you win it. So they are never available on the open market.
We have time for one more question. So,
Ma'am,
Where?
excuse me, here.
Oh, yes.
Ma'am, you are of 71. What makes you so lively?
Well, nothing from a chemist shop, that's for sure. No, gardening. Love of beauty, love of walking, love of landscape, love of the natural world. Yes, that keeps one permanently young.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
and with that, we come to the end of the first session at the at the RP Sanjeev Goenka Group, Baitak. I'd like to thank Ms. Anna Pavord and Mr. Pradip Krishen for truly a very interesting session on tulips. And we'd like to remind the audience that they can go nearby the Mughal tent for a session of author signing, so they can get any books signed over there if they feel that they want to get that done. And we will be beginning the next session in a matter of another 5 minutes. Since this was a slightly delayed session, there will not be an extended gap between the two sessions. So for those of you attending the next session, we advise that you remain seated.